Hello. For this, the third in our series on Victorian Art Pottery, we'll be looking at the wares produced by the firm of Doulton & Co. at their Lambeth Pottery in London, a pottery which became world famous for the production of art wares during the second half of the 19th century. The rise of Doulton & Co. as one of Britain's leading Victorian art pottery manufacturers came about by a series of external events which were probably not realised by the firm themselves much before the middle of the 1840s. Without the Victorian interest in public health, in particular sanitation, the development of art pottery would probably have been a very different story. In a period of growing wealth and status consciousness, order and cleanliness became synonymous with respectability as well as health. In 1848, the Health of Towns Act initiated a move towards the general provision of piped water and sewage disposal, and soon the orders for ceramic pipes were rolling in. One man who had the foresight to appreciate the size of the requirements was Henry Dalton, who turned his Lambeth pottery over to the large-scale production of stoneware drain pipes. The orders were huge and soon made his fortune, and it was because of this financial security that he was able to indulge himself in the late 1860s in risking some of his funds on the production of what was the first factory-made art pottery in England. He joined his father's firm when he was 15 years old. He was born in 1820, and he joined the firm as an apprentice, but soon became a very important member of the management team. He was known for his innovations, and by the time he was 30, he was very much the driving force behind the company. He introduced steam power to drive potter's wheels, and in 1846 created the first factory in the world for the manufacture of salt-glazed vitrified stoneware pipes. And from that grew a whole area of previously unheard of ceramic production in terms of the manufacture of sanitary wares, toilets, pipes, etc. The factory had been making stoneware articles, things like beer bottles, jugs, etc., going right back to the inception of the firm under his father, John. But now a whole new world opened for this London-based factory. It was the beginning of a new era in not just industrial production, in the production of what might be termed industrial wares, but also art products, art pottery. And these became very much part and parcel of the production of the company. By the 1860s, with financial security very much established by Dalton's, Sir Henry, as he became, was able to start to indulge his taste for art. He became friendly with John Sparks, who was in charge of the local Lambeth School of Art. Sparks is very keen to develop careers for his students, particularly in the areas of pottery making. And so he had originally approached Dalton to take on several of his students to create artwares in pottery. Initially, Henry Dalton was not that enthusiastic, but soon he decided that he would like to create an art pottery studio. And so we see a gradual expansion of both his interest and his actual financing of art pottery production. It must be noted, I think, that probably much of his production of art pottery was not particularly profitable, but the sanitary wares, the pipes, the toilets, the sinks, they all contributed to supporting his indulgence in this rather more artistic area. The sculptor, George Tinworth, who had trained at the Lambeth School of Art and subsequently at the Royal Academy, was taken on by Doultons in 1866. He worked on the decoration of ceramic vessels, but also on statuary for Doulton's architectural ceramic wares, an area which was becoming a very important part of the firm's business. In 1867, Doulton's exhibited a number of art wares at the Paris International Exhibition of that year, and the success and the critical success that these wares received when exhibited amongst Doulton's other sanitary wares gave him the encouragement to expand into this new area. This early success was followed by a larger exhibition at the International Exhibition in South Kensington in 1871, and it's from this period that we see Doulton beginning to take on more of John Sparks's Lambeth School of Art students, amongst them people like Hannah Barlow and her brother Arthur, and other art students as well. And it's really from, I suppose, 1871 that the story of Victorian Art Pottery at Doulton's really begins. The expansion of the new art studio was rapid. In 1873, Doulton's employed 7 artists making art pottery. 12 years later, that number had risen to 250. And as can be seen from this picture, many of the people involved in creating the beautiful products that the factory was becoming increasingly proud of were women. This was a welcome new development, an occupation that could be undertaken by middle-class women, particularly those who were not married or who were young. It was very difficult for such ladies to find occupations that were suitable for them. But at Doulton's, of course, the fine decorative techniques that were in use were often made by women. They were able to show their manual and artistic dexterity on the products that they produced. By 1876, the demand for Doulton wares, their sanitary wares, their pipes, but also their terracotta and stoneware faience tiles for architectural purposes, became so great that it became necessary to build new factories to produce these wares and satisfy the demand. New studios, workshops, kilns, and showrooms were constructed at this time in the mid to late 1870s. 2 large buildings on the Albert Embankment are no longer with us, but a smaller factory, which is situated at the corner of Lambeth High Street and Black Prince Road, still exists, and we can see the entrance to the showroom on the screen at the moment, built around the second half of the 1870s. Above the main entrance to the showrooms is a terracotta panel designed and modelled by George Tinworth, the sculptor, in 1878. The panel depicts various figures, workers, management and artists connected to the factory. For example, sitting down on the left is Hannah Barlow decorating a pot. Sitting down on the right hand side of the panel is Henry Dalton himself, and in the centre, holding a pot, is George Tinworth. More importantly, the exterior of the shop, the 2 facades on the corner plot, were meant to act as an advertisement for Doulton's products. This rather Gothic-looking building was decorated with various terracotta mouldings, columns, and coloured stoneware panels and bosses, and even painted faience tiles and tile panels. The whole creation was meant to act very much like a shop window display. You could go along and have a look before you even enter the shop to get some idea what was produced by Dalton. Beneath the main ground floor windows were panels depicting a variety of different mouldings which might be available for architectural purposes. And you can see here artist designed panels surrounded by terracotta mouldings. If you look at the to either side of the windows, you can see a variety of tile inserts. And on the screen at the moment is an example. And you can see here one of these tiles inset in the wall, now enlarged, that illustrates the main colour range for Doulton tiles at this time. If your windows were surrounded by terracotta framing, then you could also mix and match, as it were, terracotta work with, again, stoneware decorated mouldings in, again, a similar sort of colour palette, the greens, the browns and the blue, which were the predominant colours produced in Doulton stoneware at this time. The whole thing was like a shop window and offered you choice, and that was the main thing, to display as many products as possible on the exterior of the shop. There are even some figural panels as well, so you really could go and get some idea of what you wanted to purchase before you started. The Dalton experiment, what was to be a cooperation between art and industry on a unique scale with a unique vision, started in a fairly small way. When John Sparks of the Lambeth School of Art persuaded Dalton to employ a few of his students in the Lambeth Pottery, it was on very much an experimental basis. It was really, I suppose, good fortune that the early studio wares were so enthusiastically received. We've mentioned at the Paris exhibition of 1867 and the exhibition in London 1871, that Dalton eventually really did become much more enthusiastic about this project. He gave his full support to the scheme, and by the 1880s, the Lambeth Art Pottery Studio was, as we have said, employing over 200 men and girls. Early Dalton wares, such as those as you can see on the screen at the moment, were often decorated with incised ornament, and they certainly weren't particularly colourful. We just mentioned, when looking at the outside of the showroom, that greens, browns and blues were the predominant colours in early wares produced by Dalton. And this, of course, was largely because the colour palette was rather restricted, I suppose, by physics, with firing temperatures of around 1250 degrees C. Most of the different pigments that might have been used were actually vaporized, but cobalt blue remained. Sometimes it was not particularly dense and looked more ghost-like than anything else, but it was a colour that could be relied upon. It's where we get our, I suppose, love of blue and white from, because it was something that the Chinese found out very early with their own ceramics. So cobalt oxide is the thing producing this wonderful blue colour. However, it wasn't just the physics of the kiln that were to create this condition, the colours that we used, for indeed it's also to do with the influences that brought about the type of wares and the type of decoration that Dalton's became well known for. Indeed, the initial influence and inspiration for Dalton's saltglazed stonewares appears to have been grès de Flandre, as Rhenish stonewares were called in the 19th century. As you can see here on the left-hand side, here is a saltglazed stoneware jug with pewter mount, you'll notice at the top, from Westerwald in Germany, and this is late 17th century. The manufacture of saltglazed stonewares in the Rhineland had continued for centuries between the 16th and the 18th centuries, and there was a long tradition of importing these stonewares into London, including, of course, the well-known Bellarmine jugs, those with a face just below the spout on the jug, which you may have seen in museums. And it was this tradition that was also of interest to Dalton and friends who collected things like this Westerwald jug. The Lambeth works of Doulton Co. have become the best known producers of these saltglazed stonewares, but it should not be forgotten that similar products were made by the firm of C.J.C. Bailey at their Fulham Pottery between 1864 and 1889, a similar period to that of the early Dalton production, and also by the Martin brothers in the late 19th century produced similar wares. And for these other manufacturers, the inspiration of the German wares was very much the same. On the screen at the moment, we can see a saltglazed stoneware jug by C.J.C. Bailey's Fulham Pottery in London. It's dated to 1875, and as it says on the label, the similarity to early Dalton stonewares is quite remarkable, and from a distance it would be very easy to confuse the two factories' products. The majority of Dalton's artwares were produced in saltglazed stoneware, a traditional London ceramic fabric and glazing technique. However, the vessel forms, decoration and range of colours that were developed created a range of wares that was anything but traditional. Decorative techniques used on these wares included sgraffito, carved and applied ornaments. These stonewares, which established Dalton's leading position in the manufacture of art pottery, continued to be produced well into the 20th century. Doulton art pottery is eagerly collected today, and the names of a number of the Victorian artists who worked in the Lambeth pottery have become very familiar to collectors. The so-called big names, those artists whose works make the larger sums of money in the auction rooms, sometimes running into thousands of pounds, include George Tinworth, the sculptor, Hannah Barlow, Florence Barlow, her sister, Florence Lewis, Mark V. Marshall, Eliza Simmons, and Linnie Watt. Let's have a look at some of those wares, see what the products actually look like. Here we have Victoriana at its best. On the screen, a couple of views of a typical Doulton stoneware vase by George Tinworth, produced in 1876. His GT, the George Tinworth monogram, is clearly visible, incised into the side of the vase. You can see that on the picture on the right-hand side. More often, Doulton artist marks are found incised on the base of the vessel, but it's not uncommon for them to appear in the field of decoration. As we mentioned before, the colours, the browns, the greens, the blues are typical of Doulton wares of the 1870s. On the screen is another piece of design by George Tinworth. It's a Doulton candlestick, typical colours of course, with cherubs, designed and worked by George Tinworth and assisted by Elizabeth Sayers, again dating to 1876. Doulton vessels, as it says in the label, are rarely the work of a single artist. More normally, someone like Tinworth would be responsible for the main decoration, and subsidiary decorative work would be left to a less accomplished artist. No disrespect to Elizabeth Sayers in this case, it's very precise and complex decoration, but it will be largely the cherubs and the overall shape design that will have been down to George Tinworth. And just to prove my point, here's another vase by George Tinworth. this time assisted by Mary Thompson. Some typical Doulton colours, the blues and the greens and the browns. The brown, of course, very much dependent on how much iron was in the clay, iron oxides in the clay. The decoration is partially incised, but all those little sort of relief mouldings will be applied decoration. The flowers around the centre of the vase, the little, almost like little pearls that surround the neck and just above the base, these will all have been applied before firing. Most Doulton vessels of this type are thrown by hand on a wheel, and it's very difficult, of course, to produce this sort of decoration by any other form than moulding and applied decoration when you are throwing on the wheel. It's easier to do when you mould a vessel in a mould, but that's not usually the case with Doulton vessels of this type. And here we see another piece by George Tinworth, but rather different. Although in his day he was very well known for, among other things, religious bas-relief sculptures, he was a very religious man. In today's market, which perhaps is less interested in this sort of artwork, collectors think of Tinworth more as the creator of a series of amusing miniature models of animals, particularly, as we can see here, creatures such as frogs, but also mice. And these can often fetch four-figure sums in the marketplace. They are quite rare. And here's another example. This is Tinworth's figure group entitled Scandal. And you can see here the mice around the table. I like the little baby mouse underneath the table. But the three of them, presumably, gossiping and creating the scandal, as it were. They are, as I've mentioned, very, very sought after. We'll move on now to the very famous Hannah Barlow, the first woman to be employed in the art studio by Henry Doulton. Now, as we mentioned, some of the finest pieces of stoneware were produced by female artists with great dexterity, but it's Hannah Barlow who is almost certainly the best known of the whole group. She worked in a sgraffito technique, incising drawings of a variety of animal subjects onto the surface of the pots before they were fired. There were, of course, many other artists, and they all developed their own forms of decoration. For example, Mark V. Marshall, who utilised modelled and applied creatures such as lizards to give his pots a sculptural appearance. These are also much sought after, though we don't deal with them any further in this presentation. The picture of Hannah Barlow that you can see here with one of her dogs. She was very fond of animals, having been brought up on a farm as a child. This picture probably dates around about 1913 when she retired from the factory. It's very much in contrast to this picture, which shows Hannah almost at the beginning of her long career with Doulton's. So let's have a look at some of Hannah Barlow's creations, her works. On the screen is a Doulton Lambeth stoneware vase, a rather beautiful one, by Hannah Barlow, incised with a band of cows, donkeys and goats. Carries her incised monogram and a variety of other impressive marks. It's a rather beautiful vessel that you could expect to pay for a vase of this sort of size, 28.5 centimetres in height, figure exceeding £500, probably more like 1,000. It depends very much on who's in the auction room, of course, when this sort of thing comes up, but also how attractive the design is. This one has animals and trees. It's rather nice. And also the condition of the vase itself. It's a very, very nice piece. Here's another vase with a typical Hannah Barlow scene of ponies and cattle. In this instance, Hannah is assisted by her sister Florence and also by Rosina Brown and others. It dates to 1878. And you can see there the main decoration by Hannah Barlow, but the other decoration, the sgraffito work and the applied decoration around the shoulder of the vase by her colleagues. Here we can see a detail of the vase with its horses, and you get some ponies, and you get some idea of how the work is produced. She used a sharp implement to draw, incise a line. The outlines of the drawing are quite spare. There is shading, but not particularly much of it. It's basically a technique where you do the main outlines with good solid line, and the implement that she uses incises or marks a line on the surface of the leather hard clay before firing, and then the whole area is covered in a blue, usually a blue stain, which when it's dried is rubbed away, leaving a small amount in the grooves that are produced by Hannah Barlow's designs. And then when it's fired, of course, this colour is still there, whereas it's disappeared from the rest of the surface of the pot. This is usually what the term sgraffito means in terms of Dalton. Obviously, it has a much wider meaning. Traditionally, sgraffito would mean the use of two colours, perhaps a dark colour with a lighter slip over it, where you would actually incise or scratch away the lighter layer to reveal the coloured layer beneath. But that's not the case with most Dalton work, some but not many. Usually it's this technique where a stain, a mineral stain, is rubbed in, or well, right the way across the surface of the decoration, and then it's wiped away to leave a little bit like printing ink on a printing plate, to leave the design coloured in the way that it is. So they're quite simple outlines, but it's really in the whole construction of the scene and also the quality of the forms. And Hannah could produce very detailed drawings freehand and on both paper and clay surfaces. So very talented. She painted as well. Here we have another Hannah Barlow decorated Doulton stoneware vase, again with horses, this time dating to 1877. Whilst we're looking at this picture, it might be worthwhile comparing the very high quality Hannah Barlow scene around the centre of the vessel to particularly some of the leaf work, the incised leaf work round the top of the vessel. Here, Barlow's work stands out as being of high quality, but she has, of course, assistants, some of whom don't seem to have been quite as good as Hannah Barlow herself. Looking at the same vase in this illustration, we can see the base of the vessel and the names of the assistants who worked with Hannah Barlow on the decoration of this pot. And we're talking about presumably the incisive leaf work and things like the floral bosses that you see or have seen around the lower part of the vase. And so looking at it very carefully, we can see this is a very informative piece of pot. We can see there what looks to be a shape number, but we can see 1877, the date when the vessel was produced. In the centre, we have Hannah Barlow's BHB. Note the first B is reversed, so it's a reverse B, HB. That's Hannah Barlow. who created the horse scene, but we also have the EAS for Elizabeth A. Sayers, and we have the MT mark, which is the mark of Mary Ann Thompson on this piece as well. We've mentioned those two artists in previous images relating to assistance on George Tinworth pieces. But it's quite interesting. You do get an awful lot of information on the bottom of our Doulton stoneware pot. And here's a close-up of the same vessel, really just to show the quality of Hannah Barlow's marvellous work. It really is quite an attractive piece. Just to finish off looking at Hannah Barlow's work, here's a very nice pair of vases, Doulton Lambeth stoneware vases by Hannah Barlow, incised with a band of resting deer between foliate borders. It's as usual at this time in shades of green, brown and white on a buff ground. Has impress marks, artist marks with an incised monogram, and this pair 35 centimetres high. Rather nice. You do get Doulton vases like this, but without the Hannah Barlow panel around the middle. And if it's just plain green and brown with the odd little bit of other decoration, you can be talking just for a few hundred. But equally well, a good pair of Hannah Barlow decorated vases like this can go well up into the four figures at an auction. And here is another one, another vase by Hannah Barlow, this time quite early in her career, 1874. She basically, I think, hit the ground running. She was good at this right from the very beginning. In fact, I think it's fair to say that her style didn't change that much over the years in terms of her incised decorative panels. The rest of the vase decorated in typical Doulton style and colours. And now we can see a pair of Doulton Lambeth stoneware vases, very much like sort of small jardinières. They're 25 centimetres high, dated 1881, designed by Hannah Barlow and incised with resting, grazing and galloping horses. And this is 10 years after she first started at the firm, and you can see the style doesn't change a great deal. She was very versatile and could produce a lot of subjects, horses, deer, goats, sheep, etc. And occasionally one or two rather more exotic beasts. And here is one of those unusual pieces, this time with an incised scene of lions. Now, Doulton's did produce a number of wares for export, in particular for places like Canada and Australia, often with the flora and fauna native to the places that the pots were being exported to. But there's no real reason to think this was destined to travel to Africa, for example. But it is quite an exotic subject, quite a rare subject for Hannah Barlow. And the subject matter alone is enough really to escalate the price on a piece like this if it comes to auction. They're quite magnificent and not completely unusual, but after what we've seen with the bases, it might seem a little bit unusual to you to look at where the Hannah Barlow mark occurs. So if you look towards the base of the pot, between the paws of the lion, we can see that Hannah Barlow's mark appears actually the lower edge of the incised scene. Here we have it, BHB. You can still see the lion's foot, and there we are. You can perhaps relate back now. We've moved this detail shot to show where that monogram occurs. A very beautiful vase indeed. Before we finish with the Barlows, one must remember that Hannah Barlow's brother Arthur and her sister Florence also worked at Doulton's, producing decorated stoneware vases, amongst other things. And here's a rather nice drawing by Hannah, I believe, of her and her sister Florence working together in their studio in 1877. As we said, several members of the Barlow family worked at the Lambeth factory, but before we leave the family, let's just have a look at some of the works created by Florence. Right, here's a Doulton stoneware tankard that I think you'll have seen in early episodes of this series. It has incised decoration, but it's by Florence Barlow. Her initials FEB are plainly visible on the base of the vessel. You can see that in the picture on the right-hand side, along with the Doulton Lambeth mark and the date for 1874 within that mark, which occurs actually on the foot rim of the vessel. Now, it's wonderful quality. It has probably been damaged at some point, and so it's had a silver or silver plate rim added to keep the vessel for the owner. But the actual sgraffito work is very high quality, but it's much more common to find this in the work of Hannah than it is Florence. But it just goes to show how versatile certainly Florence, but many other Doulton artists were. They could turn their hand to a whole variety of techniques. Here we have a picture of a pot and a picture of Florence herself as a young woman, 1877. Now, Florence Barlow is best known for her birds, her representation of birds, and in particular the use of the pat technique of decoration as seen here in the main bird decorated roundel. It's a typical Doulton vase with sgraffito and applied decoration, but with this wonderful added representation of a bird. And this is produced by this technique, pat, whereby Florence has taken thick coloured slips and built these slips up one layer above the other to create an outstanding vision of this bird in relief. So it's like painting a very thick paste onto the vessel, and you build up this paste layer by layer to give you this sort of three-dimensional quality. It's like a very shallow bas relief sculpture, but it's done by this multiple application, layer after layer of thick clay slips. A wonderful piece. Here we can see another Doulton vase with work by Florence Barlow in Pats of Pat. You can see the bird there. An interesting piece because it has a panel of birds by Florence Barlow, but it also has a panel incised with children and a donkey by her sister Hannah around about 1885. And we've already talked about Doulton artists working together, but this is a good example of the two sisters, Hannah and Florence, working together to produce this rather beautiful piece. And a piece which is produced in these two very different, very diverse techniques. And to finish off, looking at the works of Florence Barlow is another beautiful Pats of Pat decorated piece showing owls, I believe they are owls, on tree boughs between borders of mice. If you look to the shoulder, just below the neck of the vase and just above the base, you'll see borders of mice in shades of green and brown on a buff ground. Very, very interesting, thinking about what will happen when the lights go out and the owls chase the mice. Again, very beautiful, typical Victorian subject matter, rendered in amazingly well-defined Pats of Pat detail by Florence Barlow. Just to finish off our look at Royal Doulton stonewares, and we could choose dozens, hundreds, thousands of pieces to look at that are not particularly by the Barlows or Mark V. Marshall or any of the other very famous artists. We're having a look at this Royal Doulton stoneware jardiniere and obviously stand moulded in low relief with floral cartouche in shades of green, blue and brown, and it has the Dalton impress marks underneath. The jardiniere stand was a particularly popular Victorian vessel. Many thousands will have been produced by Dalton, both when it was the original Doulton of Lambeth and later on when it became Royal Doulton. And it's typical in both colour and in design. Sometimes the design is applied, sometimes it's moulded, but this would appear to be towards the end of the century, around the end of the century, because of the curvilinear features. Like other art pottery producers, Doulton & Co adopted the fashions of the time, some of the curvilinear elements of Art Nouveau style towards the end of the century. And as we've said, jardinières were a particularly popular Victorian form, perhaps because they were useful. You could put your aspidistra in the pot on top, or another another plant suitable for growing inside or in the conservatory, but also because they're quite large, and so you get plenty of decorative space, as it were, to show the quality of the work, the decorative work. Now, this is just, as it were, a footnote to end our look at the stonewares produced by Doulton at Lambeth in the late 19th century. And to finish off with particular thoughts on what we just mentioned about style, we have Doulton Lambeth ware. In keeping with the current vogue for hand-painted earthenwares, around about 1873, Doultons went in for a new range of painted wares called Doulton Lambeth Faience. It was introduced and became quite popular. This range is frequently painted with scenes of flowers or birds, and it was very much in the French style of the period. Although never as important to Dalton as the stonewares, these faience pieces were quite popular and were made up until the outbreak of World War I, and they are particularly related to the fashions of the period. The French in the 1870s were producing a lot of hand-painted plaques and vases, and during that same decade, in the 1870s, they became very popular in England, and that popularity continued certainly into the 1880s, even 1890s. So this is really another important range of material, and we will be looking at painted wares like this, not necessarily all Dalton ones, but certainly looking at painted faience wares in another episode of the series on Victorian Art Pottery. Here, for example, is another Doulton & Co faience vase decorated with flowers and butterflies by Florence Lewis, and some of the artists worked on both stonewares and on faience, but also there were some that worked exclusively on either stonewares or faience. We know the names of many of these artists, either by their marks or signatures, and this is a particularly nice piece of work. So, to finish off our look at Doulton pottery, and in this instance Doulton faience, I'm just showing you this final picture, really just because I like these vases very much indeed. Quite large examples, 45 centimetres high, a pair of Doulton faience vases painted with sprays of convolvulus in colour. Absolutely wonderful. Good impressed and painted marks underneath, and I'd love these on my mantelpiece at home. Unfortunately, I don't own them, but they are very, very beautiful. And that's where we end. barring, of course, a little epilogue on where to go next. So, to finish up, I thought it would be a good idea to recommend a little reading for you. And so, principally under the suggested reading, we have this volume, the Doulton Lambeth Faience, published by Richard Dennis Publications, and still available, I believe. This book, the book shown here, the Doulton Lambeth Faience, is still, I think, the standard reference work for Doulton Lambeth Faience. It's a very, very comprehensive survey, a lot of detail of the Lambeth factory, initially written by Desmond Isles a number of years ago, but recently, in recent years anyway, updated by Louise Irvine, one of the great names in Doulton scholarship. So if you do wish to either find a copy of this in a library or buy one for yourself, I can assure you it's a very, very good read indeed. So there's a good piece of homework for you to follow up on. There are, of course, a few other places in terms of learned tomes that you may like to look at, other avenues to pursue. We're quite lucky with Doultons. Unlike many Victorian art pottery manufacturers, such as Bermondov's, Linthorpe and Bretby, all of whom do have some publications relating to them in existence, the products of Doulton Lambeth are extensively covered in literature. So rather than paraphrasing these works here, it's suggested you read the original material for yourself relating to Doulton. So there's a lot to read if you wish to follow this particular factory up. But if not, you might like to try one of the 4 sources below. And I've marked out there the page numbers that might be the most useful to you in each of these publications. And now for some final comments, and it's worthwhile, I think, thinking about what's written here. Although the products of the Doulton works are important in terms of both aesthetics and ceramic history, the wider significance of the Lambeth studio was in its effect on the ceramic industry as a whole. It was a large-scale operation and it had a lot of influence on what happened in other areas. Its success led to several other major ceramic firms starting their own art pottery studios. They'd made perhaps household wares before, now they wanted to become a bit more artistic. And it also led to the development of entirely new concerns being founded for producing art wares. Of the former, mention should be made of Minton's Art Pottery Studio at Kensington Gore, existed from about 1871 to 1875, and of the latter, those new firms such as Linthorpe, Bretby and Delarobia of Birkenhead. Added to these can be firms whose expertise had previously been in other ceramic fields, such as tile making, for example, Moore & Co. of Jackfield in the Ironbridge Gorge. We won't be looking at everything to do with art pottery, but we'll be looking at firms like Linthorpe, Bretby, and a few other makers in future episodes of this series on Victorian art pottery, and I hope that you will look at those and learn, but principally enjoy the content. Thank you very much for your attendance in this session.